Who would ever respect you for anything you actually did yourself? Richard asked, smiling as if he had just delivered the cleverest line of the evening. For a moment, nobody at our table moved. Daniel lowered his eyes toward his water glass. Vanessa pressed her lips together, though I could see the beginning of a smile she was trying not to show. My granddaughter Claire stared at Richard with the kind of disbelief young people have not yet learned to disguise. I was 68 years old, and I had lived long enough to know that some questions are not questions at all. They are invitations to defend yourself. I had stopped accepting those invitations. I folded my linen napkin once, placed it beside my plate, and looked at Richard across the table. They already do, I said. His eyebrows lifted. Then he laughed. It was a comfortable laugh, confident and practiced, the laugh of a man who expected everyone else to join him. Vanessa did. Daniel did not. Claire certainly did not. We were celebrating Richard's 63rd birthday at Bellamy House, an expensive restaurant outside Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of place where the lighting was soft, the waiters remembered which side to serve from, and a steak cost more than I used to spend on groceries for an entire week when Daniel was a boy. Richard loved places like that. He loved polished silver, reserved tables, and being greeted by name. More than anything, he loved being seen succeeding. Richard was my late husband Thomas's younger brother, and for most of the 36 years I had known him, he had treated conversation like a scoreboard. Someone bought a new car, Richard's was newer. Someone took a vacation, Richard had already stayed at a better hotel. Someone mentioned a promotion, Richard knew someone higher up the ladder. Thomas used to squeeze my hand beneath the table whenever his brother started performing. Let him have his parade, he would whisper afterward. Thomas had been gone for 4 years. There was no hand beneath the table anymore. Come on, Eleanor, Richard said. Do not look so serious. We are family. Family. It was remarkable how often that word appeared immediately after someone said something they would never say to a stranger. I am not serious, I replied. I answered your question. Vanessa reached for her wine glass. I think Richard just means that Thomas handled most of the important things. That was how your marriage worked. She said it gently, which somehow made it worse. Vanessa had been married to my son for 11 years. She knew how to wrap an insult and concern so neatly that objecting to it made you look unreasonable. I glanced at Daniel. He was 41 now, with his father's dark hair beginning to gray at the temples. He still had Thomas's habit of rubbing his thumb along the edge of a glass when he was uncomfortable. He was doing it then. Mom did plenty, he said finally. Richard leaned back. I am sure she did. I am talking about something of her own. Claire put down her fork. Grandma has her own life. Of course she does, sweetheart. Richard smiled at her. I am talking about accomplishment. Reputation. The sort of thing that earns respect outside your own family. I almost admired the irony. Outside my own family was precisely where I had learned what respect felt like. I took a sip of water. The salmon is getting cold, I said. Richard shook his head, amused. You always do that. Do what? Change the subject when things get uncomfortable. I looked at him. I thought I answered you. His smile faded by half an inch. That was all. But I noticed. Claire noticed too. Before Richard could continue, a man passing behind my chair slowed down. I recognized him immediately, although it took him another second to place me without my usual navy blazer and reading glasses. He was in his early 50s, wearing a charcoal suit, and he had been dining with 3 people near the windows. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Richard stopped talking. I turned. Hello, Mr. Bennett. The man's face brightened. I thought that was you. He extended his hand, then seemed to remember we had met often enough that formality was unnecessary. I have been meaning to thank you. The winter program exceeded every projection. We served almost twice as many families as last year. That credit belongs to the staff, I said. You know better than that. He smiled. The board approved the expansion Thursday. Unanimously. Claire's eyes moved from him to me. Vanessa slowly lowered her glass. That is wonderful news, I said. Please tell everyone I will see them Wednesday. Absolutely. Enjoy your dinner. He nodded politely toward the table before walking away. Silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. This one had questions inside it. Richard watched the man cross the dining room. Who was that? He asked. I picked up my fork. Someone who knows me. From where? Vanessa asked. I tasted the salmon before answering. It was cold, just as I had said. Work. Daniel looked directly at me now. What work? There it was. Not accusation. Not ridicule. genuine confusion. My own son was looking at me as though a door had appeared in a wall he had passed every day for years. I could have explained everything then. I could have listed meetings, budgets, programs, names, years, and numbers. I could have placed my life on the table beside Richard's birthday cake and invited them to measure it. Instead, I set down my fork and looked at the four faces around me. Claire looked curious. Daniel looked unsettled. Vanessa looked suspicious. Richard looked annoyed. For years, they had mistaken my silence for emptiness. I realized there was no reason to correct them all at once. "Nothing you need to worry about tonight," I said. Richard gave a short laugh, but this time nobody joined him. The drive home from Bellamy House took 27 minutes, and for most of it I listened to the soft hum of the tires against the highway. Richard's question did not bother me as much as Daniel's expression afterward. My son had looked at me with genuine confusion when Mr. Bennett mentioned the board and the winter program. That stayed with me. Richard had always underestimated me. Daniel had simply stopped wondering. There was a difference, although I was beginning to understand that the result could feel remarkably similar. When I reached my house in Greenwich, I left my coat over the back of a kitchen chair and made chamomile tea. The house had belonged to Thomas and me for 29 years. After he died, people began referring to it as my house, but for a long time I still thought of it as ours. His gardening gloves remained in a drawer near the mudroom. His favorite coffee mug sat behind mine in the cabinet. I had stopped preserving everything exactly as he left it, but I had never felt the need to erase him either. For years was enough time for grief to become quieter without becoming smaller. My phone lit up on the counter. "Daniel." I watched it ring until voicemail picked up. A minute later, a message appeared. "Mom, call me tomorrow when you have time. I want to ask you something." I already knew what he wanted to ask. I turned the phone face down. There had been a time when Daniel knew almost everything about my days. When he was young, he would sit at the kitchen counter doing homework while I balanced household bills, scheduled appointments, helped Thomas prepare documents for his business, and organized volunteer projects through our church and local community center. None of it looked impressive from the outside. It was simply life. Thomas built a successful commercial property management company, and because his name was printed on the office door, people assumed the success belonged entirely to him. Thomas never did. "You see the things I miss," he used to tell me. Richard saw it differently. At family gatherings, he introduced Thomas as the businessman and me as the one who keeps him civilized. Everyone laughed. I usually did too. Back then, the joke seemed harmless. After enough years, I began noticing that Richard never asked what I thought about business, investments, or community projects, even when I had spent hours helping Thomas think through those exact matters. If I offered an opinion, Richard would turn to Thomas for confirmation. If Thomas agreed with me, Richard accepted the idea as Thomas's. Thomas noticed. I told him not to make an issue of it. Peace mattered more to me then, or perhaps I believed it did. After Thomas died, Richard's assumptions hardened. At the first Thanksgiving without my husband, he stood in my kitchen carving the turkey and told Daniel that I was fortunate Thomas had left everything organized. I remembered drying a serving platter while he spoke. He did not know that I had spent 3 months after the funeral reviewing insurance policies, property records, tax documents, and investment accounts with our attorney and accountant. He did not ask. The following spring, Richard suggested that I hire someone to handle my finances before they became too complicated. I thanked him and changed the subject. Vanessa was more subtle. She never openly called me incapable. She simply began explaining things I already understood. Mortgage rates, property taxes, retirement accounts, even online banking. Once, while we were having coffee, she reached across the table and showed me how to enlarge the text on my own phone. I let her finish. "That should make things easier for you," she said. "Thank you," I replied. What I did not tell her was that I had spent the previous morning reviewing a 6-page grant proposal on my laptop before approving a $48,000 community program. Silence can be generous. It can also become expensive. The more I allowed my family to assume, the less they bothered to learn. Daniel was the part that hurt differently. He had not become cruel. Cruelty would have been easier to identify. He became busy. Calls that once lasted 40 minutes became 10. Sunday visits became occasional dinners. When Vanessa answered questions for him, he let her. When Richard described me as sheltered, Daniel rarely corrected him. Sometimes he smiled as though the description were affectionate. I told myself that grown children build lives of their own. That was true. But distance does not always arrive in miles. Sometimes it arrives in what people stop asking. They asked whether I was sleeping well, whether I needed help with the yard, whether I had remembered to schedule my annual physical. Nobody asked what I was working on. Nobody asked where I went every Wednesday morning carrying the same leather portfolio Thomas had given me for our 30th anniversary. Nobody asked why my calendar contained meetings in Hartford, Stamford, and New Haven. They saw a widow filling her time. I saw work that mattered. The Whitmore Community Foundation had begun modestly 12 years earlier, when Thomas and I funded a local employment program for women returning to work after long absences. Thomas provided much of the original money. I provided much of the structure. After his death, I could have stepped away. I did the opposite. I learned more. I listened more. I made mistakes quietly and corrected them carefully. The foundation grew because good people worked hard, not because my last name was attached to it. I never felt compelled to announce that at dinner. Respect that requires an introduction has always seemed fragile to me. The next morning, Daniel called again. This time I answered. "Mom," he said, after the usual greetings. "What exactly were you and that man talking about last night?" I looked at the leather portfolio resting beside my breakfast plate. For several seconds, I said nothing. Then I realized something almost sad enough to make me smile. My son was finally asking about my life. It had taken a stranger recognizing me in a restaurant for him to become curious. Daniel waited through my silence, and I could hear the faint sound of traffic through his hands-free system. He was probably driving to his office in Stamford. Years ago, he used to call me during that commute simply because he had 20 minutes to spare. Now there was usually a reason. "His name is Robert Bennett," I said. "He serves on the foundation board." Daniel paused. "What foundation?" I looked through the kitchen window at the bare maple tree beside the driveway. "The Whitmore Community Foundation." Another pause. "Dad's foundation?" 3 words told me almost everything. "Your father and I started it together." I remember him mentioning donations, but I thought that was mostly something he handled through the company. "I know." Daniel seemed to hear something in my answer because his voice softened. "What does that mean?" "It means you remember the version you were told most often." I was not trying to punish him. I had no interest in making my son feel small. But at 68, I had grown tired of making every truth comfortable before allowing someone else to hear it. Daniel asked how involved I was. I told him I had a meeting Wednesday morning and that I chaired the board. He went quiet again. "Since when?" "For 7 years." 7 years? Yes. I could almost picture him doing the arithmetic. Thomas had died 4 years earlier. That meant my work had not begun as a widow's hobby, which was probably the explanation he had been preparing for himself. "Why did I not know that?" he asked. I carried my coffee to the table and sat down. "That is a better question for you than for me." He exhaled slowly. "Mom, that is not fair." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps it was not entirely fair. Children grow up. Careers expand. Marriages take attention. Parents learn to accept shorter calls and busier calendars. I understood all of that. What I had not understood was how easily concern could replace curiosity. Daniel still cared whether my furnace worked. He cared whether I drove after dark in bad weather. He cared whether someone shoveled my front walk after snow. Those were loving things. But somewhere along the way, he had begun caring for me as though my life were becoming smaller. Mine was doing the opposite. "Do you remember Thanksgiving 2 years ago?" I asked. "At your house?" "Yes." He hesitated. "Mostly. I remembered it clearly. Vanessa had arranged the seating that year. She placed me near the end of the table beside Claire, which I enjoyed, while Richard sat near Daniel discussing commercial real estate. Halfway through dinner, Richard asked Daniel whether he had considered buying a second property as an investment. I mentioned that interest rates and maintenance costs made the timing worth examining carefully. Richard smiled and said, "Eleanor, we are talking about investments, not household budgets." Daniel laughed. Not cruelly. Automatically. I remember lifting my water glass and taking a sip. 10 minutes later, Richard repeated almost the same point I had made. Daniel nodded and called it smart. I did not correct either of them. A month later, at Christmas brunch, Vanessa mentioned that Claire might apply for a summer internship with a nonprofit. I told her I knew several organizations that offered excellent programs for college-bound students. Vanessa smiled and said, "That is sweet, Eleanor, but I mean established organizations." I was serving coffee at the time. I filled her cup and asked whether she wanted cream. Small moments. That was how it happened. Nobody announced that my opinions no longer mattered. Nobody held a family meeting and assigned me the role of harmless widow. They simply began speaking over me, around me, and eventually for me. The strangest part was how easy I made it for them. Silence had always been my way of keeping peace. I had learned it during 38 years of marriage, not because Thomas demanded it, but because family life often required deciding which arguments were worth having. After he died, I kept using the same habit in a different world. Richard mistook it for ignorance. Vanessa mistook it for dependence. Daniel mistook it for contentment. I do not remember that, Daniel said after I reminded him about Thanksgiving. I know. His answer hurt more than if he had defended himself. Was I really that dismissive? You were busy. That is not an answer. It is the answer I gave myself for a long time. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he said, I am sorry. I believed he meant it. I also knew an apology could not restore years of conversations that never happened. I have to get into the office, he said. Can we have lunch this week? Not Wednesday. Foundation meeting? Yes. There was a small change in his voice when he answered. Right. Of course. After we hung up, I opened my calendar. Wednesday was full. Thursday afternoon was not. I wrote Daniel's name there in pencil. That evening, Vanessa called. Unlike Daniel, she did not begin with an apology. Eleanor, Daniel told me about the foundation, she said. Apparently, we have all been kept in the dark. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Kept in the dark? You know what I mean. This is a significant part of your life. It is strange that your family knew nothing about it. I thought about the Christmas brunch, the coffee cup, and her careful smile when she told me she meant established organizations. Vanessa, I said, you have been in this family for 11 years. How many times have you asked me what I do on Wednesdays? She did not answer immediately. That is not really the point. I think it might be. Her tone cooled. I just think families should know these things about each other. So do I. The silence that followed was sharper than anything either of us had said. Then Vanessa changed the subject. She asked whether I had given any more thought to what she called my housing situation. I looked around the kitchen Thomas and I had renovated 15 years earlier, at the oak cabinets we had chosen together and the breakfast nook where Claire once colored pictures while I cooked pancakes. What housing situation? I asked. Vanessa gave a small sigh, the kind people use when they believe patience is being required of them. The house, Eleanor. We talked about this. It is too much space for one person, and Daniel worries about you managing everything alone. There it was again. Not a question, a conclusion. And this time, I did not change the subject. The house is not a situation, I said. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. I could hear the faint clatter of dishes on her end of the call, followed by the sound of a cabinet closing. I did not mean it that way, she said. Then how did you mean it? Another pause. Eleanor, nobody is trying to tell you what to do. We are trying to think ahead. I looked around my kitchen again. The refrigerator was humming. Morning sunlight rested across the oak floor. A grocery list in my handwriting was held to the refrigerator door by a magnet Claire had made in elementary school. Nothing about the room felt unmanageable. Thinking ahead for me is still thinking for me, I said. Vanessa sighed. You know Daniel worries. Daniel can tell me that himself. Her voice became softer. You are 68. There is nothing wrong with admitting that maintaining a house this size might eventually become difficult. Eventually. It was an interesting word. It could mean next year or 15 years from now, but Vanessa spoke as though eventually had already arrived. If that day comes, I will make a decision, I said. Until then, there is nothing to discuss. We ended the call politely. That was another family habit I had perfected. Even disagreements were wrapped carefully enough to leave no fingerprints. Wednesday morning, I drove to Stamford for the foundation meeting. Our office occupied part of the third floor of a renovated brick building a few blocks from the train station. There was no marble lobby, no impressive fountain, and no brass plaque announcing my importance. I preferred it that way. The receptionist, Melissa, handed me a folder as I walked in. The New Haven numbers came through, she said. Better than expected. How much better? 23%. I smiled. That is worth coffee. By 9:30, 8 of us were seated around the conference table reviewing the winter employment program Robert Bennett had mentioned at dinner. We had originally expected to help 80 women complete job readiness training. The final number was 146. Some had spent years caring for children or aging parents. Some had lost jobs after companies closed. Others simply needed current computer skills and help explaining long gaps on a resume. I understood the last group more personally than anyone in my family would have guessed. There are many ways for a person to become invisible. Age is only one of them. We spent 2 hours discussing budgets, transportation assistance, childcare grants, and partnerships with local employers. Nobody asked whether I needed help understanding the spreadsheets. Nobody explained basic financial terms to me. When I disagreed with Robert about expanding too quickly, he listened. Then he disagreed back. That mattered to me. Respect was never people nodding because I was older. It was being taken seriously enough to be challenged. Near noon, the conference room door opened and Melissa leaned inside. "Eleanor, there is someone here to see you." I expected a donor. Instead, Claire stepped into the room carrying a paper bag and wearing jeans, white sneakers, and the green sweatshirt she practically lived in whenever she was home from college. "Grandma," she said. "Claire, what are you doing here?" "Dad said you had a meeting in Stanford." I was nearby. She lifted the bag. "I brought lunch." Everyone smiled. Robert stood and greeted her. "You must be Eleanor's granddaughter." Claire looked at him, then at me. "You know my grandmother?" Robert laughed. "Everyone here knows your grandmother." Claire's expression made me laugh too. After the meeting, I showed her my office. It was small, with 2 bookcases, a desk, and a framed photograph of Thomas on the windowsill. Claire stopped beside a wall covered with photographs from foundation programs. In one, I stood beside a group of women holding certificates. In another, I was helping serve Thanksgiving meals at a community center in Bridgeport. "How long have you been doing all this?" she asked. "A while." "That is your answer for everything." "It has worked surprisingly well." She shook her head and smiled. Before we could sit down, a woman named Patricia Morales appeared at my doorway. She had completed one of our employment programs 3 years earlier and now volunteered twice a month helping new participants prepare resumes. "Mrs. Whitmore, I did not know you were here today." She stepped inside, then noticed Claire. "This is my granddaughter." Patricia's face brightened. "Then I need to tell you something." Claire glanced at me. "Your grandmother changed my life." I immediately shook my head. "Patricia, you did the work." "She always says that," Patricia told Claire. "But when I came here, I had been out of the workforce for 12 years. I thought nobody would hire me. Your grandmother sat with me for almost an hour after everyone else went home. She told me that taking care of my mother for 8 years did not mean I had done nothing for 8 years. Claire became very still. Patricia smiled at me. "I start my 4th year with the hospital next month." "And they are lucky to have you," I said. After Patricia left, Claire sat across from my desk without opening the lunch bag. "Grandma, why does nobody in our family know about this?" It was the second time in 2 days someone had asked me that question. "People know pieces," I said. "Grandpa knew everything. Dad did not. Your father knew the foundation existed." He stopped asking what I did there. Claire looked toward the photographs again. "Uncle Richard definitely does not know." "No. After what he said at dinner, you should tell him." "Why?" She stared at me as if the answer were obvious. "Because he thinks you have never done anything. That is Richard's mistake. Why should it become my responsibility?" Claire considered that. She was 19, old enough to recognize unfairness immediately, and young enough to believe every unfair thing should be corrected on the spot. I admired that about her. I also knew life rarely worked that cleanly. "Respect means very little when you have to demand it," I said. Claire looked at me for several seconds. Then she finally opened the lunch bag. She had brought 2 turkey sandwiches, apples, and oatmeal cookies from the bakery near campus. We ate at my desk while she asked about every photograph on the wall. She asked real questions. Not whether I was tired. Not whether driving to Stanford was difficult. She wanted to know how grants were approved, how programs were selected, and why Thomas and I had started the foundation. I answered every one. That afternoon, when Claire hugged me goodbye, she said something quietly near my shoulder. I wish I had asked sooner. I watched her walk toward the elevator and understood why those 6 words meant more to me than anything Richard could ever say. Vanessa did not respond immediately when I told her there was nothing to discuss. Then she said, "I think you are taking this personally." I almost laughed. It was my home, my age, and my future being discussed, so I could not imagine how else I was supposed to take it. "I am taking it accurately," I said. Her voice tightened. "Daniel and I are only trying to help." "Then ask what help I need." "You always say you do not need any." "Perhaps you should believe me." That ended the conversation sooner than either of us expected. When I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a moment with my hand resting on the counter. I was not angry. Anger would have been simpler. What I felt was the strange clarity that comes when a pattern finally becomes impossible to ignore. Richard dismissed what I knew. Vanessa explained my own life to me. Daniel worried about me without asking what I wanted. Each act looked small by itself. Together, they formed something larger. By Thursday afternoon, Daniel was sitting across from me at a small cafe near his office in Stamford. He had chosen the place because he only had an hour between meetings. 10 years earlier, I would have rearranged my entire day around that hour. This time, I had already been in Stamford meeting with our program director, so the timing happened to suit me. Daniel ordered a turkey club. I had tomato soup and half a grilled cheese sandwich. For the first few minutes, we talked about Claire and her college classes. Then Daniel put down his coffee. Vanessa said you two had an argument. We had a conversation. She thinks you are upset about the house. I am not upset about the house. Then what are you upset about? I looked at him. The assumption that everyone except me gets to decide when my life has become too much for me. Daniel leaned back. Nobody is deciding anything. Your wife has mentioned selling my house 3 times in 6 months. She is planning ahead. For whom? He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his cup. There it was again, that familiar movement. Mom, the house is almost 4,000 square feet. 3,860. He gave me a tired smile. That is exactly my point. And my property taxes are paid. The roof was replaced 2 years ago. I have a landscaping service every other week from April through October, and a cleaning service comes twice a month. What part are you concerned I cannot manage? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. It is not just maintenance. What is it? Being there alone. I understood that concern. I even appreciated it. But concern becomes something else when it refuses to listen. I have neighbors on both sides. Margaret Collins lives 6 minutes away. Claire visits when she is home. I drive. I work. I travel. I am not isolated. I know. Do you? He looked down at his plate. The waitress came by and refilled our water glasses. Neither of us spoke until she walked away. Vanessa found a condominium development in Darien, he said finally. I stared at him. She found what? She was only looking. 2 bedrooms, elevator building, 24-hour front desk. It is close to us. Did I ask her to look? No. Did you? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation answered me. You did. I told her it might be worth seeing what is available. I placed my spoon beside the bowl. You and your wife are shopping for my next home without telling me. That is not what happened. Then describe it differently. He rubbed his forehead. Mom, please. Nobody signed anything. Nobody called a realtor about your house. We were gathering information about a decision that belongs to me. Yes. He said it quietly this time. It does. That single word changed the conversation. I did not need him to surrender. I needed him to recognize the boundary. You may worry about me, Daniel, I said. You may offer help. You may tell me what you think. You may not make decisions for me. He nodded slowly. That is fair. And Vanessa needs to understand it too. I will talk to her. No, I will. His eyes lifted. Mom, she and I are both adults. You do not need to carry messages between us. For the first time that afternoon, he smiled without looking uncomfortable. You really have changed. I considered that. Maybe you just started noticing. 2 days later, Vanessa came to my house. She arrived shortly after 11 on Saturday morning, carrying a bakery box from a place I liked in Old Greenwich. Peace offerings in our family usually contain butter and sugar. I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table. Vanessa apologized for looking at condominiums without speaking to me first. I thanked her. Then she added, but I still think you should consider it. There was the apology, followed immediately by the reason she believed she had been right. I opened the bakery box and chose a blueberry scone. I will consider moving when I want to move. Of course. Not when Daniel wants me to. Not when Richard thinks I am too old for this house. Not when you find a building with an elevator. Vanessa folded her hands. Richard has nothing to do with this. He talks to Daniel more than you think. Her eyes shifted. I noticed because Vanessa rarely allowed her face to answer before her words did. What has Richard said? I asked. Nothing important. Then it should be easy to tell me. She looked toward the window. He just thinks Daniel may eventually have to take more responsibility for things. What things? Your finances. The house. Decisions. I took a small bite of the scone and chewed before answering. Richard believes your husband should take responsibility for my finances? Eventually, there was that word again. I set the scone down. Vanessa, I chaired a meeting this week approving more than $200,000 in program funding. I reviewed every line before I voted. I think I can pay my electric bill. Her cheeks colored slightly. I did not mean you were incapable. Then stop preparing for my incapability. She became quiet. I expected defensiveness. Instead, something closer to embarrassment crossed her face. I suppose I did not realize how much you were doing. No, I said. You did not. She nodded once. It was not an apology, but it was the first time she had allowed the truth to remain in the room without explaining it away. After she left, I cleared our cups and put the remaining pastries in a container. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Richard inviting the family to dinner the following Friday. He had written that he wanted everyone together because there were a few family matters worth discussing. I read the message twice. Then I placed my phone on the counter. For the first time, I wondered whether Richard's concern about my future had ever really been concern at all. Richard's message stayed on my phone for most of Saturday afternoon before I answered. Friday works for me, I wrote. Nothing more. Within 2 minutes, he responded with the name of Bellamy House, the same restaurant where we had celebrated his birthday. Apparently, one uncomfortable evening had not diminished his affection for the place. During the week, I heard very little from the family. Claire called Tuesday night to tell me about an economics exam. Daniel sent a message Thursday asking whether I still planned to attend dinner. Vanessa said nothing. I spent Wednesday at the foundation office, Thursday reviewing grant applications from home, and Friday morning meeting Margaret Collins for coffee. Margaret had been my friend for 23 years and possessed the useful habit of listening without trying to repair everything she heard. When I mentioned Richard's invitation, she stirred cream into her coffee and said, "Family matters?" His words. That sounds ominous. It sounds like Richard. Margaret smiled. Are you worried? I considered the question. No. I am curious. That was true. A week earlier, I might have spent hours imagining what Richard wanted and preparing ways to keep everyone comfortable. Now I found myself unwilling to do that work for him. If he had something to say, he could say it. Friday evening was cold and clear. I arrived at Bellamy House shortly before 7. Richard was already seated with his wife, Susan, at a round table near the windows. Daniel and Vanessa arrived a few minutes later, followed by Claire, who had driven down from campus for the weekend. Richard stood when I approached. Eleanor, glad you came. His tone was unusually warm. You invited me. I was not sure after last week. Why would last week stop me? He studied my face for a second, then pulled out my chair. Dinner began normally. Richard talked about a commercial development in Westchester County. Susan described plans to remodel their guest bathroom. Vanessa mentioned a fundraiser at Claire's former high school. Nobody brought up my house, the foundation, or Mr. Bennett. For nearly 40 minutes, I wondered whether I had misread the entire invitation. Then the entrees arrived. Richard waited until the server had placed the last plate on the table before setting down his wine glass. There is something I think we should discuss while everyone is here. Claire glanced at me. Daniel looked at Richard. What? Richard leaned back. Eleanor's future. I cut a small piece of salmon. My future is here too, Richard. You can speak to it directly. Susan lowered her eyes toward her plate. Richard gave a patient smile. That is exactly what I intend to do. We have all been thinking about what makes sense for you over the next few years. Have we? Claire asked. The adults, Claire. Her expression changed. I am 19. You know what I mean. I did. Richard preferred rooms where authority could be arranged by age, income, or volume, depending on which measurement placed him highest. Daniel cleared his throat. Richard, Mom and I already talked about the house. Good. Then this should be easier. He turned toward me. Eleanor, that property is too large for one person. The market is strong. Selling now would give you options. I already have options. Of course, but there are practical considerations, such as maintenance, taxes, financial management. Eventually, Daniel will have to become more involved. Daniel immediately shook his head. I did not say that. Richard looked surprised. You do not have to. That is what families do. I set down my fork. My taxes are current. My house is maintained. My finances are managed. By you? Richard asked. The question was quiet, but Claire heard what was inside it. So did I, yes. By me. Richard smiled faintly. Eleanor, Nobody is questioning your intelligence. That sentence almost always means someone is about to do exactly that. Then we can move on, I said. He did not. Instead, he began talking about Thomas. According to Richard, his brother had always handled investments, property, and major financial decisions. I listened while he described my marriage to me. Daniel shifted in his chair. Vanessa remained very still. Thomas was exceptional with money, Richard said. He built everything from the ground up. He worked very hard. I agreed. Exactly. Which is why I think we need to be realistic about what happens when someone like Thomas is no longer here to handle things. Claire put her fork down. Grandma handles things. Richard smiled at her. You are loyal. That is good. It is not loyalty if it is true. Claire, Daniel said quietly. She looked at her father. What? Everyone keeps talking about Grandma like she is not sitting here. I reached over and touched her wrist. It is all right. No, it is not. Let him finish. Richard looked almost grateful. He mistook my patience for permission. Thank you. My point is simple. There is nothing wrong with recognizing what each person is good at. Thomas had business instincts. Daniel has them too. Eleanor has other strengths. Such as, I asked. Richard hesitated. You were a wonderful wife. You are a devoted mother and grandmother. There it was. Praise shaped like a boundary. And outside those roles, I asked. Susan looked at him then, perhaps hoping he would stop. He did not. Why does everything have to become a competition? Richard said. It does not. Then why are you suddenly acting as if everyone has underestimated you? I have not said that. You do not have to. Ever since that foundation business came up, there has been this attitude. Vanessa looked at him. Richard. He raised one hand. No, let us be honest. Thomas funded charitable work for years. Eleanor continued some of it. That is admirable. But it does not mean she suddenly became some independent businesswoman. I noticed Daniel's jaw tighten. You do not know what she does there, he said. Richard shrugged. Neither did you until last week. Daniel had no answer for that. Richard turned back to me. You spent most of your adult life supported by a very successful husband. There is no shame in that. I just do not understand why we now have to pretend otherwise. The table became quiet. I could hear silverware touching plates at nearby tables and the low murmur of conversations around us. I folded my napkin once and placed it beside my plate. Richard watched me, apparently expecting an argument. Is that what you wanted everyone here to discuss? I asked. I want the family to be realistic. About me. About the future. My future. He exhaled. Fine. Your future. I nodded. Then here is something realistic. You may have opinions about my life. You do not have authority over it. Richard gave a short laugh. Authority? Eleanor, nobody is trying to control you. Good. Then there should be no problem. He leaned forward slightly. You know what your problem is? You have spent so long being protected by Thomas that you think being treated carefully is the same as being respected. Claire stared at him. Daniel said his name in warning, but Richard continued. Outside this family, outside people who knew Thomas, who exactly do you think sees you as anything more than his widow? I looked at him across the white tablecloth. A week earlier, I might have tried to prove myself. That night, I felt no such need. You seem very interested in the answer, I said. Richard smiled. I am. I picked up my water glass. Then perhaps you should pay attention. Richard held my gaze for a moment, then leaned back as though he had decided I was bluffing. Pay attention to what? He asked. Dinner, I said. Claire lowered her eyes, but I caught the small smile she was trying to hide. Daniel looked less amused. Vanessa reached for her water and took a slow sip. Susan began cutting her chicken into pieces that were far smaller than necessary. Richard looked around the table, waiting for someone to rescue the conversation. Nobody did. Well, he said eventually, that was dramatic. You asked a question, and apparently I am supposed to wait for some mysterious answer. You do not have to wait for anything. I returned to my salmon. For the next several minutes, Richard talked about the Westchester project again, but something had changed. His voice was louder than before. He mentioned square footage, financing, and a developer he knew in Manhattan. I listened without comment. Then I noticed a woman approaching our table. She was perhaps 55, with short blonde hair and a navy coat folded over one arm. I recognized her as soon as she smiled. Eleanor Whitmore, she said. I thought that was you. I stood. Linda, how are you? Much better than the last time you saw me. She laughed softly and took my hand in both of hers. I have been meaning to call the office. I got the position at St. Catherine's. You did. Monday was my first day. That is wonderful. Her smile widened. Full-time. Benefits too. You earned it. I had help. She glanced toward my family. I will not interrupt your dinner. I just wanted to say thank you again. If your return to work program had not existed, I do not know where I would be right now. Linda, you did the difficult part. You always say that. She squeezed my hand once before letting go. Have a good evening. When she walked away, Claire looked directly at Richard. I gave her a small warning glance before she could say anything. Richard cleared his throat. One of your charity cases? The phrase landed badly. Even Susan looked at him. One of our program graduates, I said. That is what I meant. Then that is what you should have said. Daniel looked at me. Is that the same program you mentioned at lunch? One of them. How many programs are there? Before I could answer, another voice came from behind me. Mrs. Whitmore, twice in 2 weeks. I am starting to think Bellamy House is your second office. Robert Bennett stood beside our table with a man I did not recognize. Robert, I said, please do not tell Melissa that. She will start forwarding my mail here. He laughed. I wanted to introduce you to Dr. Samuel Harris. He is with the Connecticut Workforce Partnership. Dr. Harris extended his hand. Mrs. Whitmore, I have heard a great deal about your foundation. Hopefully some of it was good. Enough that I am hoping we can convince you to join our regional advisory committee. Richard stopped moving. Robert smiled. I told him he would have to compete with the rest of us for your calendar. Robert exaggerates. Not often. Dr. Harris thanked me and said his office would contact Melissa the following week. After they left, I sat down again. The table remained quiet. Richard picked up his wine glass, but did not drink from it. Vanessa was the first to speak. Regional Advisory Committee? It is only a conversation, I said. They have not asked me formally. They just did, Claire said. I smiled. Informally. Daniel looked from me toward the other side of the restaurant where Robert had returned to his table. How many people work for the foundation? Directly? 12 full-time employees. We also partner with several local organizations. Vanessa blinked. 12. Yes. And you manage them? Melissa manages operations. I chair the board and work closely with the executive director. Richard finally found his voice. So Thomas left enough money to build a decent little organization. Claire's expression hardened. Uncle Richard. What? I am complimenting it. I put my fork down. Thomas and I provided the original funding. After he died, we changed the structure. Most of our annual budget now comes from outside donations, corporate partnerships, and grants. Richard shrugged. Money attracts money. I looked at him. Sometimes. Good results help. Daniel asked, how large is the annual budget? I hesitated, not because the number was secret, but because I disliked what the conversation was becoming. I had no desire to turn my life into a financial exhibit. Large enough to require an independent audit every year, I said. Claire smiled again. Richard did not. A few minutes later, our server arrived to clear the dinner plates. As she lifted mine, another woman stopped beside our table. Her name was Diane Foster, and she served on the board of a housing nonprofit in Bridgeport that had partnered with us for 3 years. She greeted me warmly, asked about an upcoming grant review, and thanked me for supporting an expansion project. By then, even I could appreciate the timing. When Diane left, Susan gave me a thoughtful smile. Eleanor, I had no idea. There was no accusation in her voice. Only surprise. Most people did not, I said. Apparently, Richard muttered. Vanessa turned toward me. Why would you keep all of this from us? I looked at her. The question sounded almost injured. I did not keep it from you. You never told us. There is a difference. What difference? I glanced at Daniel. He already knew the answer. I could see it in his face. You never asked, I said. Nobody spoke. Around us, the restaurant continued as if nothing important had happened. Glasses clinked. A waiter carried a tray toward the kitchen. Someone at another table laughed. Richard stared down at the white tablecloth. For years, he had assumed my silence meant there was nothing worth hearing. Now the room itself had answered him, and for once, he had nothing to add. The check arrived before Richard spoke again. He reached for it automatically, as he usually did when he had chosen the restaurant, but his confidence had lost some of its polish. Susan asked Claire about school. Vanessa looked at me twice as though she wanted to say something, and changed her mind both times. Daniel barely touched the coffee the server had brought him. When we finally stood to leave, Richard gave me a stiff smile. Well, Apparently, you have been busier than we realized. It was the closest he came to acknowledging what had happened. Apparently, I said. Outside, the November air had turned colder. Claire hugged me beside the valet stand before leaving with Daniel and Vanessa. Richard and Susan departed first. I was waiting for my car when Daniel walked back toward me alone. Mom, can I come by tomorrow? He asked. Of course. Around 10. I will make coffee. He nodded, then stood there for another second. I am sorry about tonight. You did not invite everyone there to discuss my future. No, but I let him. That was more honest than I expected. The next morning, Daniel arrived at 9:50 carrying a paper bag from the bakery near my house. Apparently, pastries were becoming the official currency of uncomfortable family conversations. I poured coffee while he set 2 cinnamon rolls on plates. We sat at the kitchen table where he had done homework as a child. For a while, he said nothing. Then he looked toward the window and asked, "How long have I been doing this?" "Doing what?" "Treating you like you are already old." I smiled slightly. "I am 68, Daniel. I qualify for several senior discounts." "That is not what I mean." "I know." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "Last night, when Richard was talking, I kept thinking about all the times I agreed with him because it was easier. The house, your finances, driving at night, even that ridiculous conversation about getting you one of those emergency buttons." I remembered it. Vanessa had brought up medical alert devices after I slipped on wet leaves near my mailbox. I had not fallen. I had simply caught myself on the fence. By dinner, the story had somehow become evidence that I needed monitoring. "You were worried," I said. I was also not listening. I let that sit between us. Daniel looked at the photograph of Thomas on the bookshelf. "Dad would be disappointed in me. Do not use your father that way." He looked back at me. "What? Thomas is not here to judge you. Neither of us gets to borrow his voice when it helps our argument." Daniel nodded slowly. "Fair. That was one of the things I loved most about my son. Once he stopped defending himself, he could listen." "Why did you never tell me how big the foundation had become?" he asked. "I did tell you things over the years." He frowned. "When? Do you remember when I went to Hartford for 3 days 2 summers ago? A conference. A statewide workforce summit. I spoke on a panel." His face changed. "I remember you saying you had meetings. You were answering emails while I told you." He looked down. "What else?" "Last Christmas, I mentioned that we had received a grant for the Bridgeport program. I thought you meant you donated to it." You changed the subject before I finished. He rubbed his forehead. "That sounds terrible. It sounds human. You are making excuses for me." "No. I am telling you that neglect is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just deciding you already know someone." He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question I had been waiting years to hear. "What do you actually do there?" So I told him. Not to prove anything. Not to make Richard look foolish. I told my son because he had finally asked. I explained how Thomas and I had begun with one employment program 12 years earlier, how we had partnered with local nonprofits, and how the foundation had expanded after Thomas died. I told him about Patricia returning to work after caring for her mother, Linda starting at St. Catherine's, and the transportation grants that help participants reach interviews and training programs. Daniel listened without touching his phone. When I finished, his coffee had gone cold. "I had no idea," he said. "No, that is embarrassing. It does not have to be. You can know now." He nodded. Then he smiled faintly. "Claire knew before I did she not? Only recently. She is never going to let me forget that." "Probably not." We both laughed, and the tension softened. Before he left, Daniel stopped beside the front door. "About the house. I am done bringing it up unless you do." "Thank you. And I will tell Vanessa the same thing. She already knows how I feel." His expression suggested he understood the distinction. Vanessa came by the following Tuesday evening. This time she brought nothing. I appreciated that more than another box of pastries. She sat across from me in the living room and went directly to the point. "I owe you an apology." I waited. "A real one," she added. No explanation afterward. That made me smile. "All right." She looked down at her hands. "I treated you like a problem, Daniel, and I would eventually have to solve." I did not realize I was doing it, but I was. The words were difficult for her. I could hear that. "Thank you for saying it. I still worry about you sometimes." "You are allowed. But I am not allowed to turn worry into decisions." "Exactly." She nodded. Then she asked, "Can I ask something that might sound defensive?" "You can ask. Why did you let us think you were doing almost nothing?" I looked at her for a moment. I did not. Vanessa started to respond, then stopped. You told me about meetings, she said slowly. Yes. And I assumed they were volunteer meetings. Yes. You mentioned programs. Yes. She leaned back against the sofa. I suppose I never asked what kind. No. Her eyes filled with embarrassment, but I did not rescue her from it. Some realizations need room. I am sorry, she said again. I believe you. Richard was different. He called 2 days later and behaved as though dinner had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. I hope there are no hard feelings, he said. There are clear feelings, I replied. That is different. He chuckled. You always did have a way with words. What did you need, Richard? His tone changed. I wanted to make sure you understood that I was only looking out for you. I understand that is how you describe it. Eleanor, come on. You spent an entire dinner explaining my marriage, my abilities, and my future to me. I listened. Now you can listen. He became silent. You do not get to speak for me anymore, I said. You do not get to use Thomas's success as evidence of my limitations. And you do not get to turn concern into authority. I never claimed authority. Good. Then giving it up should cost you nothing. Richard had no quick answer. For once, I did not fill the silence for him. 3 weeks after that phone call with Richard, I stood inside the Stanford Community Center watching Claire struggle with a name tag that refused to stay attached to her sweater. You are laughing at me, she said. Only a little. I handed her another adhesive strip. The foundation's annual winter reception was beginning in less than 30 minutes. It was not glamorous. There were folding tables covered with white cloths, trays of sandwiches from a local deli, coffee in silver dispensers, and a small stage at the front of the room. Staff members, volunteers, donors, program graduates, and representatives from partner organizations were arriving in coats damp from a light December rain. Claire had asked if she could come. I had not expected anyone else from my family. Then Daniel walked through the doors. He wore the navy coat Thomas had given him years earlier and carried an umbrella dripping onto the entry mat. When he saw me, he smiled. I hope this is not invitation only. It is not. Good, because Claire refused to tell me whether I needed a ticket. Claire appeared beside me. I told you Grandma would let you in. Daniel looked around the room. This is bigger than I expected. I smiled. You have been saying that a lot lately. I deserve that. He did not make excuses. That mattered. I introduced him to Melissa, Robert, and our executive director, Karen Walsh. Then Patricia arrived with 2 co-workers from the hospital. Linda came shortly afterward. Each person greeted me differently, but with the same easy familiarity. Nobody treated me like a celebrity. I was grateful for that. They treated me like someone whose work they knew. Daniel noticed. I could see him watching the conversations, not with embarrassment this time, but with attention. During the reception, Patricia introduced Daniel to another program graduate, a 59-year-old woman named Carol who had returned to work after caring for her husband through a long illness. Your mother understands what it is like when people assume your useful years are behind you, Carol told him. Daniel glanced at me across the room. I pretended not to notice. Later, our executive director asked me to say a few words. I stood at the small podium and looked out at nearly 100 people. For years earlier, after Thomas died, I could barely speak at a family dinner without someone finishing my sentence for me. Yet standing there did not frighten me. I talked about the year ahead, thanked our staff, and reminded everyone that the foundation existed because people deserved opportunities at every stage of life. I did not mention Richard. I did not mention the dinner. I did not need to. When I stepped away from the microphone, the applause was warm but brief, exactly as it should have been. This was not about me. That realization had become important. For weeks, my family had been surprised that people respected me. I had finally understood that their surprise was not evidence of my failure. It was evidence of how little attention they had paid. After the reception, Daniel helped Claire and me carry leftover supplies to my car. The rain had stopped, and the pavement reflected the parking lot lights. Claire went back inside for her scarf, leaving Daniel and me alone. I owe you more than an apology, he said. You already apologized. I know, but I think I have been treating an apology like it fixes everything. I closed the trunk. It does not. What does? Time. Attention. Different choices. He nodded. I can do those. Then do them. He smiled. You really are not making this easy for me. I spent 41 years making things easy for you. He laughed. That is also fair. Claire returned wearing her scarf and carrying 3 cookies wrapped in a napkin. We drove separately home. When I reached my house, I noticed the porch light I had left on that morning. For years, coming home to an empty house had reminded me that Thomas was gone. That night, it simply felt like coming home. The following Sunday, Vanessa invited me to brunch. She asked about the reception before asking about the house, which I considered progress. She wanted to know whether the foundation accepted volunteers with marketing experience. "Are you offering?" I asked. "Maybe." "Why?" She looked embarrassed. "Because I think I spend a lot of time assuming things about you, and I would like to understand what you actually do. You do not have to volunteer to do that." "I know." She stirred her coffee. "But I might like to." I told her to speak with Melissa. I would not create a role for her because she was family, and Vanessa surprised me by saying she would not want one. Richard did not apologize. For a while, he barely called. At Christmas, he and Susan came to my house for dinner. He complimented the roast, asked Daniel about work, and carefully avoided discussing my finances. Near the end of the evening, he found me alone in the kitchen putting leftovers into containers. "Susan says your foundation event went well," he said. "It did. She saw photographs online. Karen posted some." Richard nodded. "You seem to have built something substantial." There were a dozen ways I could have answered. I could have reminded him of every dismissive remark. I could have asked whether I had finally met his standard. Instead, I handed him a container of mashed potatoes. "Take these home. Susan likes them." He accepted it and gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. "You are not going to make this easy for me, are you?" "I am not trying to make it difficult." "That might be worse." I looked at him. "Richard, I do not need you to feel embarrassed. I need you to stop assuming you know the limits of my life." He nodded once. It was not a dramatic reconciliation. I did not expect one. People rarely transform because of a single dinner. Sometimes the best change is simply a boundary that remains where you put it. In January, Daniel began calling on Sunday mornings again. Not every week, but often enough that it stopped feeling accidental. He asked about the foundation. Sometimes I asked about his work. Claire returned to college. Vanessa volunteered for one Saturday workshop and later signed up for another without mentioning it to me first. My house remained mine. My finances remained mine. My schedule became busier than ever. One cold morning, I found myself thinking about the question Richard had asked and all the years I had spent quietly hoping my family would notice who I was beyond wife, mother, widow, and grandmother. Growing older had never made me invisible. I had simply been waiting to be seen by people who had stopped looking. The people who had taken the time to know me had seen me all along.